Thank you for joining Cylance today. As we are wrapping up October with National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we have been hosting a series of security-focused webinars. Our topic today is Business Email Compromise, Attack Evolution and Prevention. Today, we will study the origins of business email compromise and examine some of the most prevalent attack methods. As a quick housekeeping note, please submit your questions in the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. And Sig, are you ready to kick it off?
I am ready. Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for joining us today. As Shirley mentioned, the topic of this discussion is business email compromise. This has become a vector for attacks that has really exploded onto the scene. It's really taken off over the last 5 to 10 years or so. And I'm going to talk today about what the attacks look like, what the evolution of those attacks is kind of moving towards, and then how you can best defend yourself against this very persistent and present threat that's out there. So with that, just want to kick off, let you know a little bit about myself. This presentation is one that I first gave at our PreventCon for this year, which is the Cylance user conference. We had a great group there, did a lot of Q&As towards the end. So I really do appreciate anybody, if you have any questions. My goal today is to serve you. So please feel free to utilize the Q&A option on the Zoom webinar to submit your questions, and I will do my best to answer them. A little bit about me as your speaker. My name is Sig Murphy. I am the Consulting Director for the Western North America region for Cylance, for our professional services team. And in that role, I oversee all of our proactive engagements and reactive engagements. So proactive engagements are those that we utilize our expertise and our SMEs to help our clients prevent cyber incidents, to get them to a state of perpetual prevention through things like red teaming, penetration testing, different types of assessments. And we have a full suite, a full range of things that we do here. I also oversee our incident response work. So for clients that find themselves as a victim of a cyber incident, or more frequently these days, new clients that are being hit with different threats and find themselves in an incident, we come in and we respond and get them back to a state of prevention. So I've been doing incident response work and security work in general for over 2 decades now. I started my career at the DoD Cybercrime Center, DC3, and I was one of the founding members of the intrusions team there. So my team at the DoD Cybercrime Center was one of the teams responsible for identifying the nation-state actor threats that we've all heard being called APT these days. So back then in 2001, 2002 timeframe, my team identified some of the first kind of common indicators of compromise amongst the threats that were facing the armed services, and really helped to, with the advocacy of our general officer, help to raise the flag to the rest of the US government about that. So I've been dealing with that type of adversary for a number of years, and helping clients and organizations around the world deal with combating them. In 2007, while I was still employed at the DoD as a contractor, I started doing nights and weekend work as responding to commercial incident response matters. So I was the lead investigator for a number of large-scale commercial incident responses. Many, actually, 99.9% of the matters that I helped lead, I cannot talk about. But there's a few out there that, due to legal proceedings or other reasons, I can talk about a little bit. And so one of those that you've probably heard of is the TJX or TJ Maxx and Marshall's hack that occurred in, I think it was 2006, 2007 timeframe. That at the time was the largest credit card incident in U.S. and world history, and it still stands as I think one of the top five. And at the time, the vast numbers of credit cards that were affected and clients and customers that were affected by that really kind of paved the way for a lot of the regulations that are in the most recent version of the payment card industry, right? DSS, or basically the document and the policies that people must adhere to if they take credit cards. When that occurred, that was just a unfathomable number, and it took there was a lot of firsts that occurred on that case with our techniques to address the attackers and also to analyze the card data. The reason that I can talk about it is because the head of the group that carried that out kind of did a little Scooby-Doo villain thing during his sentencing and called out our team that basically helped lead to his arrest. So it is in the legal documentation out there that my team was on the other side of that and actually really effectuated that, helped law enforcement with that arrest. So since then, I've really specialized on commercial intrusions and commercial matters, and that's really become my passion. My goal is to help as many folks and companies and organizations out there to A, prevent cyber attacks, and B, if they find themselves in a situation where they're a victim of a cyber attack, then help them get through it. And I've led a number of very large engagements, a lot of the ones that you've heard about in the news over the years, and some against nation state actors, some against financial actors. And over the last 7 or 8 years, I have led the response to a number of these business email compromise matters. So outside of work, I am a husband, a father, and for about 20 minutes a morning at between like 5 a.m. and 5:20, I'm a gamer as well to kind of get my mind going. But because I have 2 kids, that's hard these days. So with that, today we're going to talk about business email compromise. We're going to talk about the historical aspects of BEC, how it came into prevalence as an attack vector. We're going to talk about the current trends. So basically, what are we seeing these days and how has it changed? And then how are these newer types of attacks affecting the victims that are out there? Then we're going to talk about protecting against business email compromise attacks. And lastly, what to do if you find yourself as a victim of these attacks. Now, real quick, a note about the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, this was a presentation that I gave at our PreventCon 2018. So that is our user conference, meaning that all of the attendees there were Cylance customers using Cylance Protect and Optics. And so some of the slides, basically, I kind of dismiss things as, well, you're protected because you have Cylance Protect, Cylance Optics. So I will try and make sure that I address those for the larger audience here, because I know that a lot of you out there are not current Protect or Optics clients. So business email compromise, or somewhat what is sometimes called CEO fraud, and I don't like that name, we'll talk about that in a slide or two, is a type of attack that is, it's targeted at organizations and sometimes individuals, but mainly organizations, in order to commit financial fraud, to defraud them of money. And this is an incredibly large and growing problem, and the attackers have been very savvy with how they're carrying these out. So just in the 3 years between 2013 and 2016, according to the FBI statistics, there were 40,000 incidents of BEC, business email compromise, responsible for losses of $5 billion, $5.3 billion. That's incredible. And unfortunately, from being a person and a leader who is responsible for helping to investigate these, and with our teams being on the front lines of a number of intrusions and incidents at any given time, I have a first row seat to see that this problem has gotten way worse since 2016, and the attackers have gotten more and more savvy. So in general, the attacks have a few common traits. So the first is that this is an email attack. That's kind of a given from the title. The second is that the attackers will do various types of attacks that masquerade their true identity. So there's a few different types of attacks that they utilize to try and get a vector in. We'll talk about a few of those shortly. So I always like when I talk to audiences asking questions, and on this slide, I asked the audience before I got to it, how many of you were the victim of this type of attack in the last, let's say, 5 years? And I had a few hands go up, but the numbers are staggering. So last year in 2017, almost 80% of US businesses were the victim of this type of fraud. That's incredible in an awful way. We've seen a marked uptick in the last 4 years. If you look from 2014 through 2017, we started at a really bad 62, and then we got to an amazingly bad 78% last year. And the reason for these attacks being successful is, I think many. And part of it is some trends we're seeing in the technologies that folks utilize for email communications. Part of it is just that the motivated attackers on the other end are getting money. You saw the $5 billion slide in the previous slide. And so there's a fertile ground there. And anywhere that there is money available, you're going to see attackers try and exploit that. So similar to another type of attack that we've seen rising in the last 4 or 5 years is that ransomware, targeted ransomware attacks, which we've seen on the rise. The attackers are doing that because there's money available and people are paying out to get their access to their own assets. Well, in this instance with BEC, as you can see from the slide, it's becoming a greater and greater threat. So I have a graphic on the slide from Proofpoint, which talks about one type of business email compromise. So I want to keep that and foot stomp that for everybody. So one type, which is basically some of the more traditional attack vectors here, is to send an email that is malformed. And basically the majority of those are reply to spoofing. So what that means is that an attacker sends an email to an organization and they might do some intelligence before they send it. But basically they craft their email so that when somebody in that chain responds to them, they actually respond to a different address. So they're kind of hijacking the email thread using that attack vector. They also can do other things like spoofing the domains, which we actually are seeing much more of. And then they get into some pretty technologically advanced techniques, which we're going to talk about shortly. One interesting statistic as well, or set of statistics, is to look at who these emails are targeting. So remember when I previously said I don't like people calling this CEO fraud, because really, if you look at the left, which is who's being targeted by these attacks, CEO is not in that list. It would be more accurate to call it CFO fraud, but even that is not as accurate as just calling it business email compromise. So you can see this, the chief financial officer is targeted 47% of the time. HR is targeted 25% of the time. And really that HR targeting is more of, looking for sensitive information about people or trying to effectuate another type of financial attack. Traditionally, business email compromise attacks are similar to what we saw in the last slide. So basically, an attacker sends a weaponized email to kind of pray and spray. They send it to multiple folks inside of a victim organization. And the attacker clicks on the attachment, which looks like something that they may or may not be expecting, and they compromise their computers with that attachment. So this is really old school due to increased viability and effectiveness of the countermeasures to this, such as Cylance Protect as kind of an AI-enhanced antivirus killer. These attacks have worked less and less as the technology has increased to combat them. But we still see this. We still see attackers out there trying this method because it's fairly easy and fairly low tech. You can go out and grab malware on the dark web. You can attach it to an email, and then you can send it to as many folks as you can find or guess their email address. And people, I think the click rate for this is, I think it's still about 5 to 10%. So if you send it to 10 people, the chances are that one of them is going to click on that email and be compromised. The more recent attacks, we've seen a number of studies and a number of kind of post-charging and arrest interviews that show that basically the attackers are now doing significant open source reconnaissance before they carry out their attack. So the attackers these days will spend between 8 to 12 hours or so per victim on the large targets, and they will search the internet for anything that is out there in this kind of clear web or open source, so basically the standard internet, that would indicate or provide them with information about their target. So they can look for such things as email addresses, so they don't have to guess at those. They can look for business relationships. So basically they can kind of map out the victim and their relationships with other third parties before they carry out the attacks. Then the attackers will register a malicious domain. So for instance, if they were trying to spoof Cylance, they might do CY1ANCE or something similar, something that looks to the quick glance like it is the actual domain that they're targeting. Then after doing that research, they craft carefully constructed emails, and they use those emails to send in, and then basically ask for things that look like normal business processes. So this is why the CFO is targeted very frequently, or folks in the financial part of the organization. They will routinely try and basically these attackers will map out the third-party relationships, and then they'll send emails that look like they're coming from those third parties, and oftentimes they will utilize captured email chains that they've recovered or other things to craft those. And this has a much higher likelihood of affecting the victims than the previous kind of standard spray and pray type of attack. And of course, the majority of these are targeted at a wire transfer. Now, before we get into the really up-to-date techniques, I should talk a little bit about wire transfers. So wire transfers are effective for the attackers because many businesses utilize wire transfers to conduct their daily business. They also, at a certain point, the wire transfers are basically non-reversible. So usually that threshold is 3 days. They also, the wire transfers will, in some instances, obfuscate the recipient a little bit. So in some instances, the attackers can make it seem like the wire transfer is legitimate. And if the victim is not really on their guard, they don't really notice anything's out of the ordinary, and they will send those wire transfers just using this attack. But where it gets really, really devious and really complicated is when we talk about the latest type of attack. And that's the, what we call it kind of the 2018 version. So we've seen a massive, massive uptick in this kind of attack. And it unfortunately doesn't require any malware. It just requires that time that I mentioned earlier on the attacker's side to do the reconnaissance before the attack. And then it requires a little bit of technical sophistication. So how this looks is the attackers will utilize the same reconnaissance techniques to map out the relationships for a business. They will then spend a lot of the extra time mapping out those third-party or vendor relationships, especially for larger victims. And then they try and compromise those third-party victims. And what they'll do is, let's say that you have a vendor that does your grounds maintenance or your HVAC. We saw, everybody knows from the Target attack, Target was victimized through a vendor portal that was utilized by the HVAC vendor for some of their stores, and that attack kind of originated there. So the BEC actors know that, and they're kind of doing similar things here. But they will compromise a third party that has a relationship with a large victim, and then they will immediately set up email rules to basically usually automatically delete or bitbucket emails with certain characteristics, like certain subjects or from certain senders. And then they will set up a forward rule so that the email is automatically exfiltrated out of the organization to an email address that they control. And what they're doing is they're basically getting access to that third-party person's email and then weaponizing it. And then they spend their couple of hours inside that email account and basically find out how that relationship between the third party and the large victim occur, and what types of emails would be expected in that relationship. What's the cadence of those emails? Who's usually on the emails? Is there an attachment? If so, what does that attachment look like? We've oftentimes on this type of attack, we've seen the attackers download like invoices and other things from these third parties. And then what they do is they craft up a domain that looks like kind of like an application. So for instance, for invoices or others, they might craft a domain that looks like box.com, but for the victim. Or they might do some sort of tax processing or something that's an application that the victim is expecting to use, but usually doesn't authenticate into. They send an email into the victim from that compromised third party with an attachment that looks like something that the victim's going to expect from that third party. And then when the victim clicks on that attachment, they actually are challenged for their email credentials. Using most organizations are using either Office 365, about 70% are, or the Gmail suite, which is about 20% these days. And so they're challenged for their login credentials. They enter their login and password for their email solution, the victim does, and then they're presented with the file afterwards. It looks to them, for all intents and purposes, like they authenticated to their email and they got to the file. And the data on the file might not be right, but at that point, the attacker doesn't care, because guess what they just did? They just captured the credentials from the victim. And they can then utilize that victim to carry out a lot of things. Further, they can basically do wire transfers utilizing actual legitimate emails from that victim. They can compromise other third parties that may have relationships with other vendors. And we see this all the time, unfortunately. The newest wrinkle that we've seen in the last, I would say, 2 months or so is really, really interesting and devious. It goes a step beyond this even. So the wrinkle that we're seeing is that the attackers, after they compromise a victim's email, they will do a wire transfer request to that victim organization from somebody within the organization, and they will CC spoofed emails from third parties like outside counsel or like your CPA or your tax firm. And what they'll do is they'll actually register domains that look like your outside counsel. So, Murphy and Murphy LLP is your outside counsel, and you get a wire transfer request from somebody in your organization. It looks legit, looks normal. They've CC'd who you think is your outside counsel, and they have a message in there. And they say, we need you to transfer $800,000. This is for the hush hush M&A that's going to occur on XYZ client, and I've CC'd counsel. They've told me that we should not email about this. We should not call about this. But if you have to, feel free to email us back on this chain only, and we'll see if we can answer any questions. And so what do our poor victims do? They see this email. It looks like they've got legitimate email from somebody in their organization, CCing legitimate outside counsel, and they go ahead and they do the wire transfer. Unfortunately, this type of attack usually occurs on a Friday. And why does it occur on a Friday? Because of that 3-day window that I mentioned earlier. So there's a 72-hour window that if a victim encounters a fraudulent wire transfer and they actually pull the trigger on the wire transfer and transfer the money, there's a 72-hour window for them to contact law enforcement, contact the banks, and to get that reversed. And if they don't act within that 72 hours, the money's pretty much gone. So this type of attack, it takes a little bit more effort on the attacker's point of view from their end. They do some reconnaissance. They figure out third-party relationships. They infect those third parties. Then they get into the email. They set up forwarding rules. All of these sound like pretty major steps, but to get to that point where they're ready to send out those emails, either compromising other further email accounts in the environment or to try and effectuate these wire transfer attacks, really we've seen only takes them 10, 12, 15 hours tops. And we know this because the reconnaissance side, we have a few a few cases that have led to arrest and other types of information or intelligence that we've gathered. On the activity side, there's just a litany of logs and other forensic data available on most of these email solutions. And we can actually go back through and forensically analyze those to see what the attackers were doing. And so that's how we know that they log in, they hunt around for a few hours, they log back out. They come back in, they hunt around for a few hours, start setting up rules, et cetera, et cetera. So really, if the payout is a piece of that $5 billion, which is, I think, even more in 2018, and it takes them 10, 20 hours worth of work, that's a pretty good payout for that attacker activity.
Wow.
So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Oftentimes, that investment, depending on the size of the company, is even less than that. It can be 10 hours or less. It's a significant payout. It's easily scalable, so they can log in from their home country of origin, from secured computers that have anti-forensic software or other things masking the tracks, and they can be working on multiple victims at once doing this type of attack. And then I mentioned the 3-day cancellation window. So all of these combined really lend themselves to why this attack is so prevalent and increasing in nature. So that being said, I would guess from the statistics and what I've talked about, and from the great attendance that we have today, I would imagine or guess that a fair amount of you have either been the victim of a BEC attack or are very interested in learning how to protect or defend against it. So now to how to protect against these attacks. So a colleague of mine who I worked with at the DoD, he and one of his colleagues put together a model called the cyber kill chain. And that colleague is Rohan Ami, Dr. Rohan Ami. He's just a great mind in the security industry, and I have a ton of esteem for him. What he did in that paper and that model, which has been widely utilized throughout the DoD and throughout US government, and increasingly utilized in the commercial space, is that he and his co-author took a traditional warfare model and they mapped the traditional warfare model to cyber attacks. And then they figured out if we start considering cyber attacks in these traditional, conventional warfare types of models, how can we basically interrupt each point in that chain and effectively kill the cyber attack. So they came up with 8 phases of that kind of traditional model that they call the cyber kill chain. And that's reconnaissance, development, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and the action. So not all of these are applicable to every type of cyber incident or cyber attack vector. But the majority of the time, this will have a number of pieces that are applicable. And so if we map the business email compromise attacks and really the gambit from the first one I talked about, which was the kind of pray and spray with the malicious attachment, to the 2018 plus model, which is the kind of informed attacker that is harvesting credentials to actually get into the environment. If we look at across the board, there are certain steps we can take when we apply to this kill chain model to interrupt that kind of attack. And so the first thing that we can thwart is reconnaissance. So how do you thwart reconnaissance from the bad guys? These attackers out there are basically sitting on the internet, and they are looking for information about you as a victim organization or a potential victim organization. So the first thing that I always tell multiple audiences on multiple different types of talks I've given, the first kind of low-hanging fruit effective countermeasure is geo-IP blocking. Unfortunately, a lot of these attacks are coming out of the Nigeria region. And this is kind of an evolution of the Nigerian prince emails. There's a couple other reasons for that, but they're having a lot of success coming from that region and kind of utilizing this model. We've also seen a lot of attacks coming from kind of some of these Eastern European nations that you may or may not have business relationships with. So the first and easy low-hanging fruit countermeasure is to do geo-IP blocking. If you don't have a business relationship with Nigeria or have business interests in Nigeria, then you should be blocking that and shouldn't be talking to them. So that's an easy low-hanging fruit item that you can do to thwart reconnaissance. The other thing that's really important is to do, basically to understand what type of information is in the clear web and the dark web about your organization. So you can do this by doing things as simple as a technique called Google dorking, which is basically turning Google or other search engines on their heads and making them return specific queries. So the attackers are utilizing this left and right. They basically can say, give me every PowerPoint that is on the acme.com domain. And the search engines will return that. And they can utilize that and harvest that for information. They are doing that. Or they can say, give me every spreadsheet that has a @ symbol in it, like a password or login, from that domain. Or give me any login from that domain that's anywhere on the internet. And so by doing these things, they can effectively, that's how they're kind of doing this reconnaissance to gather their intelligence about the victims. You can search for document repositories. There's a large number of places that you can look for this kind of open source intelligence. You can also do dark web searching, or you can hire a company to do this type of search for you. So Cylance, our professional services team, has teams that just, this is all they do basically. They go out and they hunt the clear and the dark web looking for information for our clients and seeing what's out there. And we've had some pretty crazy stuff that's exposed to the internet, or things that through a lot of mergers and acquisitions, things that companies have kind of forgotten about, or domains that are no longer really active or maintained that have some information that can be utilized in this attack. The other thing that you can do is to really know about your environment. So red teaming or pen testing is basically a way that you can kind of check to see what vectors are available for these attackers to gain access to your environment. In effect, if you are in a house and your data is in your house, and basically your organization is in this house, then red teaming will check to see which doors and windows are either open or unlocked. So how can the attackers get into my house? complementary to that and completely different is the compromise assessment. So our leadership here at Cylance and the pro services team, Corey White and others got out ahead of this about 4 to 5 years ago and created an offering called a compromise assessment. And so the red team tells you basically how can attackers get into the environment or how can they gain access to my house. The compromise assessment says, is there somebody already in my environment? Is there somebody already in my house that's already come through a window or a door and they've already gained access? They're living in my living room or eating out of my kitchen. And so the way that the team does this is they basically will use operating system commands to harvest data and metadata from the systems in an organization. And they'll also set up sensors that are looking for kind of that unknown malware. So using the AI and math models to detect malware within the environment. And by doing this, the team can very effectively see if A, the organization is a current victim of a compromise, or B, if they've been the victim of a compromise in the past. And then the other thing that people can utilize to thwart reconnaissance is just, and I'm going to hit on this in a few slides as well, but practice proper account maintenance. So if accounts are, people off board, if they leave the organization, make sure those accounts are terminated, things like that. And we'll touch on that again in a few slides. All right, so how can you thwart delivery? So how can you stop the attackers from either being able to deliver a piece of malware or to basically gain access to the environment if you have a cloud-based email provider like O365 or the G Suite? So another really low-hanging fruit, and everybody on this call is probably sick of hearing this, but enable multi-factor authentication. So this can be enabled right through O365 or the G Suite for those providers, or it can be through a third party like Duo or Okta. And basically what this does is, instead of just needing a login and password to gain access to the email in particular, every time somebody logs into their email, they will be challenged for a second factor of authentication. That's usually either an app or a text message to their phone. So the first factor is something that you know, which is your password. The second factor is something that you have. So usually your phone or an application. And what that does is that just cuts the delivery off in its tracks, just chops it off. So basically, the attackers can't get into the environment at that point. This also has another benefit of, if people are if they're used to logging into their email accounts with two-factor authentication, oftentimes when they get that email that looks a little suspicious, where they click on the attachment and then they're just prompted for their login and password credentials, oftentimes they'll know something's up right away because they won't be challenged for another factor of authentication. All right, so the other things you can do to thwart delivery are setting up proper spam filtering. So there are a number of third-party vendors out there that offer this as a service or with an application. Office 365 and actually the G Suite have spam filtering capabilities built in as well. So you turn those on. Outlook, if you're still doing on-prem email, which is actually good for some reason, for some aspects of security, you can turn that on as well and guard against that. And then really, really need to utilize effective and strong endpoint security. So this is one of those times where this talk was first given at ProtectCon. So this is one where I was talking to people that had Protect, so they were covered. But if you don't, or if you're concerned about your antivirus solution, then talk to somebody from Cylance. We can definitely get you covered, and that's a no-brainer. It's 99.7% coverage. So you install it and you configure it properly, or hire us to configure it with a white glove service called Threat Zero, and you are good to go for most threats out there. All right, so how do we thwart actual exploitation? So these are some pretty tactical steps. So some of these are applicable only to Office 365, but in general, and more applicable, you can enact a strong password policy. So this is just basic blocking and tackling for avoiding attackers successfully being able to get in your environment. You can, on your email provider or on-prem, you can create more than one global admin. And this is important because oftentimes the attackers, especially targeting large, high-dollar victims, they will try and gain access to that global admin account for the email provider, because they don't want you to be able to do incident response when you detect that something's wrong. They don't want you to be able to do forensic collection to detect that something's wrong. They don't want you to be able to kick them out of the environment. So it's really, really prudent to enable and protect another global admin account so that you can detect that you can basically utilize that in the case of an attack. And then here's some things that that are applicable to O365. So routinely, whatever provider you have, routinely analyze your mail forwarding rules. The attacker's favorite trick out there is that they gain access to an account or to an environment, and then they start forwarding specific account emails out. So if you can analyze the forwarding rules to see if there's any bad guys trying to forward out of your environment, that's really a really prudent thing to do. And then for O365, we have three things here. You can enable mailbox auditing. This is important because by default, O365 is going to really only capture kind of your logins, maybe some file actions through SharePoint or through other tools, other apps in the Microsoft suite. But it's not going to really capture that verbose logging, which is very useful to a forensic investigator like me and my team. So turning that on usually doesn't incur too much of additional cost with Microsoft, and it's something we recommend. And then you can proactively block forwarding rules. So basically you can say, don't forward emails outside of my organization via rules. And that effectively cuts that vector out as well. And then, believe it or not, a lot of people don't know, O365 and I believe G Suite as well come with malware detection. So they a lot of times can detect the presence of malware in emails and in communications, and they can basically figure out and block that proactively for you if you turn that on. So that's really a useful tool that comes installed. Again, disabling accounts that are not used in the last 30 days is really important. Preventing password reuse, that's another blocking and tackling item. And then reviewing consent grants. So consent grants basically allow certain users to do things on other users' accounts, and the attackers, not as common as the forwarding rules, but they also like to utilize those to carry out their attacks. And then how can we thwart malicious actions? So this is really important. So on the preventative side, I highly, highly recommend that everybody that's out there, your organization should have an incident response plan. And then you should also have a BEC playbook. So an incident response plan is an umbrella policy, or it's not policy, it's an umbrella plan for what your organization will do in the case of a cyber incident. And that can cover a number of different specific types of cyber incidents. So BEC, business email compromise, is a type of cyber incident. Ransomware is a type. Insider threat. Network intrusion is a type. Loss or theft is a type. And then also data denial of service is a type. So what we recommend is that you have the overarching plan or umbrella, and then you do these playbooks, which are very much more tactical in nature on literally if this, then this. So if we have a BEC attack, here's what we need to do. We need to contact inside counsel. We need to contact the executive team. We need to declare a cyber incident. It is literally like play by play what you do. And this is incredibly helpful and saves time. Remember, we're talking about a 72-hour window here. So you don't have a whole lot of time to do much of anything if you're not really targeted and effective in what you do. We also recommend doing a very aggressive policy around wire transfers. So we used to say voice verification, which was a step up from the policy that most organizations have, which was just basically email verification. We have since brought on a team member that was he's a 30-year law enforcement veteran on our team. He's our forensic lab manager. And he said, oh, no. Voice verification is old and busted. New hotness is the FaceTime verification. which basically means that if your organization is going to do a wire transfer, then you should know everybody that you're transferring to and from, or somebody from that organization. And you should be able to, in most circumstances, do a FaceTime with them to verify that it's really them asking for that transfer. And this just kills the attacker's ability to siphon money out using wire transfer. So that's very, very important. The last thing, and very important as well, is user training. So this is, as Shirley mentioned coming in, this is October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And we all, I think the reason that, that a lot of attacks happen is because the attackers are very persistent, and they really only have to get one user to click in order to get a foothold into most environments. And so effectively training your user base on what to do and not to do and what to look for is really, really a good step. Another one that was brought up during the first presentation at PreventCon, you can actually, in most email providers, you can actually enable a setting that flags any emails that are coming from outside your domain. And they basically, in large red letters on the top of each email that comes from somebody outside, it says external sender, please verify, or something to that effect. And you can actually customize that. And that's a great step. I've never met a client that was offended by receiving that. In most cases, clients applaud when other clients are utilizing that as a method or control for prevention. All right, so we've talked a lot about how to prevent the attacks, but those statistics earlier that we talked about are staggering. 78% of businesses in the US were victims of this kind of attack in 2017. So you'll be on really in a good place if you implement the things that I talked about in the previous slides, but in case you're still a victim, it's important to know what to do. So the first thing is following your IR plan. So we talked about that earlier. I need to foot stomp that. I know we're getting so much short on time. We only have about 10 minutes, and I want to take questions. So I won't belabor this, but I responded to a major incident at a victim's environment that literally the CISO there wrote a book on incident response and incident response planning. And he's a well-known visionary type in the security industry. And he had his stuff together on the IRP. They had a great plan. And the attackers were so persistent. They so wanted what was in that environment that they basically were able to gain access. And even after they declared an incident, they were able to kind of maintain their access for a little bit. We created an expulsion plan that was very aggressive and went nuclear on them pretty quick to get them out of the environment. We were successful in getting them out of the environment, but it was, let me just say, if he did not have such a well thought out and well formulated incident response plan, the cost to that company would have been tenfold just in the response and the legal fees. I mean, it would have been years of expulsion planning and then actual expulsion and then verification afterwards. And we were able to get the bad guys out within a matter of weeks. So IR plans are incredibly important. It's important to call law enforcement if you think you're the victim of this type of attack. So the FBI or the Secret Service, depending on what vertical you're in, is effectively able to help with this type of attack. And they have a playbook that they utilize. So they are fairly busy because everybody's getting victimized by these things, but they will stop and help you and work through it with you. And I've never, I'm thinking hard, but I don't think I've ever been in an environment where somebody's reached out for help and there's been any type of negative action that occurred. So they're there to help, and I highly recommend people talk to law enforcement if they're the victim. Then we start getting into the tactical stuff. And so basically you're going to need somebody to come in and look at the forensic artifacts to figure out what happened, the who, what, when, where, how, and why of the attack. So it's really important to gather all email logs, and then it could be important to gather system images or systems for analysis as well. Then in most cases, you're going to want to do a password reset. but I would check with your either internal incident response team or your vendor first to try and figure out if they know this attacker, what type of attack it is, what type of what type of vector that the attackers utilize, et cetera. These are other things that are really important. So removing mailbox delegates, again, mailbox hygiene, disabling mail forwarding rules. We talked about that earlier. So doing an audit very quickly and figuring out if there are mail forwarding rules going on. Enabling multi-factor authentication. Now, this will stop and be effective. This will stop the attackers and be effective in a lot of cases. On the really, really persistent attackers, if you enable MFA during an attack, there is a chance that the attackers will register basically MFA. And so they'll register a cell phone or other form of MFA to your environment. We've seen that in a few cases. And so you just have to watch for that. Then setting the password policy. So usually you set the password, the complexity policy to high, then do the password reset. And a lot of times that will break the attacker's access. Then enabling all forms of auditing that you can do for that forensic response. So if you find yourself in this situation where you are a victim, then you can do these steps to very quickly and effectively try and counter that. You do have that 72-hour window. It's really important to talk to law enforcement right away because they'll get you down the right path, or your IR vendor of choice. All right. So when I gave this presentation a few months ago at PreventCon, basically I wanted to, we have a very strong business email compromise response capability within the organization. Since then, we've developed another kind of core competency related to this that I'll talk about. But if you do find yourself as a victim and you need to declare an incident and you need help, please call us. We have this down to a science. So up on the screen, I have our basically our O365 flavored BEC analysis engine. So this is basically a tool that we can feed logs from O365. We have a different flavor for Gmail and the G Suite. We can feed logs into this tool and very quickly and very effectively identify a number of things. So we can right away identify forwarding rules, just like that. We can identify failed logins, successful logins, and we can do this all rapidly and pretty much on the fly as we fire off these queries. So we can really quickly tell how the attack originated. We can tell what accounts were utilized by the attackers, things like that. So subsequent to this, we also have come up with another core competency that I mentioned. So we now can do basically a red team effort into our clients' environments to test their readiness for BEC. So we can simulate a BEC attack, and we can basically try and get the client to do what's called an objective-based test, which is we can basically try and get them to transfer money. This is all done with pre-approvals and very strong rules of engagement, but we can effectively and tactically test your defenses and your security controls for this type of attack. And with that, I now see that we are 5 minutes to go. So I will pass it back to Shirley to see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Sig. Yes, we do have a few questions. The first question is there a free user training on BEC?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if there's like a course or anything out there, but I do know that the various ECTFs, which is Electronic Crimes Task Force, for if you're US based, for your region, do provide some training and some documentation. And so I kind of breezed through this earlier, but it's really a good idea to have a relationship with law enforcement before you have an incident. And that's really an overarching statement that covers anybody worldwide. In the US in particular, there are a few organizations that are really out in front of this. So the first is the ECTF that I mentioned, the Electronic Crimes Task Force. And that's a joint effort that's usually put on by the Secret Service and the FBI for your region. And they provide free events and free training and free documentation. And they do have a BEC kind of a playbook that they've put out. So I highly recommend you research the ECTF, and then also InfraGard, which is a private public partnership with the FBI. And that is, there are chapters in most of the major cities in the United States, and I think there's some international similar type chapters as well. And what that will that does is basically they meet on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, and it provides a safe and kind of non-attributional environment for private and government law enforcement partnership and collaboration. And so you can ask questions of your law enforcement counterparts if you're in the corporate side, and not feel free, or you're not fear reprisal or any type of it's just really good to have those relationships early on, utilize that type of partnership, and know those folks before you have an incident.
Thank you, Sig. Another question came in is, my company doesn't want to pay for expensive security. How can I protect myself?
Okay, well, so I think some of the earlier slides touched on some things that are usually built into things like Office 365 and G Suite, and even Exchange. And so by turning on those features that your company's probably already purchased, that's a really good way to combat a lot of this type of attack. So by turning on the malware analysis engine, the spam filtering, et cetera, that's really, really good.
Okay. Thank you, Sig.
My pleasure.
I have another question here that came in is, if someone wants to work with the consulting team at Cylance to address a BEC problem, what's the best way to reach out to you?
That's a great question. So if you think you are currently having an incident, you can contact us at ir@cylance.com. That's the IR distribution list. And that will get to the right folks. There's also a number on our website that you can call, and that's staffed 24/7 by our SMEs. And we do here at Cylance have teams around the world. So we have a team, multiple teams in the US covering all time zones. We have a team in the EU, in Cork, Ireland. We have a team in the UAE. We have a team in Tokyo and throughout Europe. And so we do have IR team members that are working literally around the clock. So if you have an incident, you call in or you email into that distro, you will get a response.
I have a couple more questions here. Is, can your team help organizations build out IR playbooks?
Yes, we can. And that is basically an offering, a service offering that we do offer. We routinely do that. It is in fairly high demand. So we like to get those scheduled out accordingly. We have a few SMEs that specialize in that. What we do is we basically come in, we do a series of interviews. We examine the people, processes, and technologies in your organization. And then we figure out, we do a little bit of a gap assessment to figure out what's kind of missing if you have an existing plan, or if you're starting from scratch, we can build out kind of what we know goes into an IR plan.
Thank you, Sig. And one more question, I know we're running out of time, is what does a typical compromise assessment look like? And what are you looking at, and does your team come on site to do that?
That's great questions around the compromise assessment. So compromise assessment is probably our most popular type of assessment for preventative measures, proactive engagement. So what we can do it remote or on site. It really depends on, we will do mostly remote, but if there's a regulatory requirement or a business need to do something on site, we will definitely do that as well. We have clients, a number of clients in the healthcare industry, hospitals and others that want us to do on-site assessments because of their PHI. Same thing with PCI data. So we can do that on-site. But what we do is we send out a quick collection script that is based on the operating systems in question. So Windows, Linux, Mac, and then all sorts of other flavors we have the collection scripts for. We call this our phase 1 collection. And it goes out and it uses operating system commands to gather forensic artifacts off of the systems in the environment. It then gathers those up in a CPU and resource conscious way, and then it sends it to us where it's processed at our headquarters. And what we do is everything at Cylance with our services team, we try and utilize artificial intelligence. And so we post-process the data that comes in using our analysis engines, and it basically sifts through, baselines it, and then looks for any type of a pattern there that would indicate compromise. And we take that kind of large corpus of data, we do that across the entire environment, and then we identify systems that might be compromised. And we then work with the clients to send out a second script, which is called our phase 2. It is still very resource conscious, but it takes the phase 1 that I mentioned earlier takes about 20 minutes to run. And it's usually between 5 and 20 megs of compressed output. The phase 2 that we send out is basically everything that's important part of a forensic image without taking an image. And that takes between 40 minutes to 2 hours to run, depending on the number of files on the system. And that is automatically transferred back to us as well. And so by using that sifting methodology, we can quickly identify systems that we think might be compromised, gather more data from those systems, and then perform our analysis and get the report out to our clients. We will, at the end of each compromise assessment, we will provide a comprehensive report with what we found. If we do find strong evidence of compromise, we will stop right away and contact the client right away and let them know that we think there's compromised systems. And then we will put that all into a report and also do an executive presentation for our clients as well.
Thank you, Sig. So we're wrapping up. We are running out of time. So thank you all for joining us today. We will be sending out the recording of this webinar in just 2 to 3 days. So thank you all for joining us at Cylance, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.